Hi everyone. After the rough power struggles of Europe, we are now heading to the land where honor is sharpest, feudal Japan. What would your life be like if you were born into a samurai family, intertwined with the sword and the rules of Bushido? You had to be not only a warrior, but also a poet and philosopher. Let's simulate my disciplined but constantly life-threatening existence together. Don't forget to like the video, and I truly enjoy reading your own what-if comments. Life began not among thick stone walls, but among simple wood and paper walls, shoji, intertwined with honor and sharp discipline. The moment I was born, my destiny was sealed with two words: warrior and servant. I was bound by absolute loyalty to my lord, the daimyo feudal lord. The sole purpose of my existence was to serve him. I was the protector of our lands and the enforcer of justice. Wealth for me was measured not by land or the number of cattle, but by the weight of loyalty and honor. The outside world was dangerous and constantly boiling with clan wars. But life inside the daimyo's castle or the dojo followed a meticulously enforced military and spiritual order. My living space, unlike the crude power of European castles, was based on simplicity and functionality. The daimyo's castle or dojo architecturally combined elegance and military function. Although built on thick, stone foundations, the interiors were divided by shoji panels, creating a constant sense of openness and discipline. For me, the castle was not just a home, but a barracks requiring constant alertness. The architecture reflected the simplicity of Zen Buddhism. There were no unnecessary ornaments. Every door, every room was organized according to the necessities of war and meditation. Childhood was spent not with games, but with strict education starting from the age of 7. The principles of Bushido integrity, respect, courage were etched into my mind even at that age. Training began with respect and obedience. Absolute obedience to the sensei teacher was essential. The foundations of martial arts, kendo, jiu-jitsu, and archery were part of the daily routine. Failure was not an option, and dishonor was the greatest punishment. The sword was not a toy for me, but my destiny. This strict discipline aimed to raise me not only as a warrior, but also as a spiritually balanced individual. Samurai women had a different warrior honor than noble women in Europe. They not only managed the castle, but also maintained the warrior spirit. Many women learned to use the naginata long polem and organize the castle's defense in the lord's absence. They were responsible for raising children according to strict Bushido rules. Most importantly, a samurai woman was ready to defend her husband or herself in moments of dishonor. This showed that they were not just mistresses of the house, but also guardians of the clan's honor. Education was not limited to martial arts. It also encompassed intellectual and artistic skills. I had to learn reading, writing, kanji, strategy, and history. Artistic disciplines as important as the sword included mastering calligraphy, writing, poetry, haiku, and the intricacies of the tea ceremony. This stemmed from the belief that a samurai should be not only a crude warrior, but also a spiritually refined administrator. Mental balance was vital for composure on the battlefield. A warrior had to skillfully wield both the sword and the brush. The katana was an extension of my soul, and its training was the center of my life. I started my sword training with a small wooden sword bokken, and eventually earned a real katana. The sword was not just a weapon, but the embodiment of the Bushido, the way of the warrior philosophy. My relationship with the sword required constant meditation and practice. Cutting, drawing, unseichi, hing, ... Every movement was the result of years of practice towards perfection. A samurai was ready to give his life to protect his sword, because the sword was his honor. Daily life and routine flowed with absolute discipline. The morning began with a cold shower, followed by mandatory Zen meditation. Meditation was vital for clearing the mind and making instant decisions during battle. The day continued with sword practice, archery, and the Lord's duties. The evening was reserved for studying and reading. Even mealtimes were conducted in silence and order. This strict routine was no different from life in a military barracks. Discipline was necessary not only to carry out our duties, but also to learn self-control. The samurai diet was simpler and lighter than the feasts of meat and wine in Europe. Staples included rice, fresh fish, seasonal vegetables, and miso soup. Overeating was frowned upon as a disrupted body and mind discipline. The tea ceremony, Chanayu, was not just an act of drinking. It was a cultural and spiritual event embodying Zen philosophy. The ceremony involved the principles of respect, purity, tranquility, and harmony. Drinking tea was also a form of meditation and mental rest for me. Health and medicine were based on herbal remedies, acupuncture, and traditional Japanese medicine. Healers used plant roots and minerals to provide treatment. Battle wounds were an inevitable fate for a samurai, and the treatment for these wounds was far from a modern operating room. Most importantly, endurance and the ability to hide pain were part of the samurai's code of honor. Sickness or injury should never be shown as a sign of weakness. Mental strength strived to overcome physical ailment. Bushido, the way of the warrior, was the absolute guide of my life. The 7 principles of Bushido: integrity, courage, compassion, respect, honesty, honor, loyalty determined my every action. Honor was more valuable than my sword. Losing honor was worse than losing life. If I betrayed my lord or suffered a shameful defeat in battle, there was only one path to salvation: seppuku. This was the final and most sacred way to preserve my honor. Seppuku was not cowardice, but the highest display of supreme courage and adherence to the code. The law of the daimyo was stricter and swifter than the arbitrary justice of a medieval lord. The daimyo, my feudal lord, was the absolute judge of his lands, and his word was law. Samurai justice was often brutal for the lower-class peasants. If a peasant showed disrespect to a samurai, the samurai had the right to instantly kill him with his sword. My fundamental legal responsibility was loyalty. My lord's enemies were my enemies. Loyalty was not just a duty, it was my identity. The hierarchy inside the daimyo's castle was very strict. Other samurai were separated by rank. Older and experienced samurai higher rank, and younger, low-ranking samurai. At the very bottom were the servants who performed the daily chores in the castle. As a samurai, my duty was to obey my lord's commands and manage the servants beneath me. Everyone had their place, and disrupting this order was considered indiscipline and a major offense. The hierarchy reflected the chain of command on the battlefield. Political life was spent under the threat of alliances, betrayals, and constant clan wars between daimyos. My daimyo's power came not only from his own swords, but also from the diplomatic ties he forged with allied clans. War could break out suddenly and change my life instantly. Marriages and land treaties were part of the ongoing political tension to form alliances. Our greatest fear was my daimyo being betrayed by his enemies and suddenly being left lordless Ronin. My armor and weapons were my work of art and my life. The armor was lighter, more flexible, but sturdier than the heavy plate armor in Europe. My armor consisted of leather, metal plates, and silk ties. I carried 2 swords, the long katana, which was my soul, and the short backup sword, wakizashi. I also used a long yumi bow for archery. I constantly had to clean, polish, and honor my weapons and armor. Every sword strike was the result of years of disciplined practice. Entertainment and leisure were filled with artistic refinements. Sword displays, theater no or kabuki, writing haiku, and performing Zen meditation in the garden. These were my escapes from the tension of war. Hunting was an amusement, but also a way to maintain my combat skills. For the samurai, leisure was not just rest, but a continuation of mental and spiritual practice that sharpened the warrior spirit. Zen Buddhism was at the center of my life and my war philosophy. Zen taught me to mentally detach from fear, death, and attachment. Clearing my mind and acting without thought, Mushin during battle was the result of Zen practice. Meditation was the source of my composure on the battlefield. Religion was not just a spiritual belief. It was the way I fulfilled my duty as a warrior. Living spaces were simpler than those in European castles, but functional. Instead of large fireplaces, small braziers, or foot warmers, kotatsu were used. Since the walls were thin, fighting the cold in winter was difficult. However, this simplicity encouraged a non-wasteful and orderly life. Comfort for me was not having thick furs, but mental peace and discipline. In my world, wealth was not in display but hidden in elegance and simplicity. The samurai's duty was not just to fight but also to manage the estates for the daimyo. The castle's revenue depended on taxes collected from the peasants in the form of rice. My economic duty was to oversee tax collection processes and ensure the rice granaries were full. Rice was the currency. Its quantity determined the daimyo's power. These duties provided me with experience not only in swordsmanship but also in administration and economy. War was an art form for us, and Bushido's ultimate test. Samurai combat tactics differed from the mass battles in Europe. Individual swordsmanship, strategic maneuvering, and duels were important. When fighting with my sword, there was no fear. My mind was empty mushin. War was not an emotional event, but a duty to be fulfilled according to the code. At the end of the battle, preserving honor was as vital as victory. A samurai would prefer to die on the battlefield than lose face. The greatest disaster was the fall of the daimyo, or the loss of my honor. This would make me a Ronin masterless samurai. Being a Ronin meant being ostracized from society, losing prestige, and suffering from hunger. I would be forced to fight merely to survive. Towards the end of my life, the country began its first contacts with the West. New European traders and military technology threatened the samurai's traditional way of warfare and life. This new world pointed to an end where gunpowder and trade replaced swords and honor. So that was my disciplined, honorable, and dangerous life as a samurai in feudal Japan. After witnessing Europe's brute force, we learned that honor here is sharper than a sword. After this journey, I realized how valuable our freedom of expression and our modern society, which is not based on status, truly are. Which brutal era should we visit in our next video? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this alternative history journey, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. See you on the next adventure. Take care.